After rescuing a little girl lost in the woods, a millionaire took her to his mansion. Days later, he returned unexpectedly and was astonished by what he found. The sun, beginning to set behind the towering pines of Willow Creek, cast shadows across the vast grounds of the Harris mansion. Charles Harris stood in his office, gazing at the dim light that filtered through the trees. The beauty of the view contrasted with the feeling of imprisonment he carried inside. The once vibrant gardens were now wild, reflecting the emotional turmoil that consumed him. Despite his financial success, the weight of his personal losses was inescapable. He had built a technology empire, but loneliness echoed through the halls of the mansion. The silence was broken only by the soft voice of his mother, Sandra, who wandered aimlessly through the house due to Alzheimer's. The housekeeper, Mary, with her usual presence, entered the office with a touch of concern. Charles knew what was coming next, another silent dinner with his mother, who was increasingly retreating into her own world. He braced himself for the familiar melancholy that these evenings brought. During dinner, Sandra, once a talented composer, mentioned something about music. His heart leapt with hope at the mention, but the moments of clarity were brief, and soon the memory of her faded again. After dinner, Charles took her to her bedroom, helping her to bed while whispering words of endearment that she could barely respond to. Back in his office, the weight of loneliness and responsibility settled over him once more. All around him, the silence seemed overwhelming, a reflection of the emptiness that had taken over his life. He picked up a framed photo of a young and vibrant Sandra, holding her first published book of poetry. The memory brought back a mix of longing and tenderness. As he set the frame down, an unexpected sound interrupted the stillness, a soft rustling coming from outside the window. Curious, he approached and looked out into the twilight, his heart racing as he spotted a small figure running through the trees. Who could it be, he thought, feeling a mix of apprehension and fascination. Without hesitation, he grabbed his coat and walked out the back door, plunging into the cool night air. The forest called to him with its dancing shadows, and a sense of urgency pushed him forward, as if that small presence held a key to something he had long lost. As he made his way through the dense vegetation, the fresh scent of pine and damp earth filled his senses. The rustling of leaves and the distant sound of a bird preparing to sleep created a sharp contrast to the silence of the mansion. Each step took him away from the oppressive solitude of his home, and something in him flared, perhaps it was a brief glimmer of hope. Suddenly, he saw the small figure running through the trees again, a quick glimpse that heightened his curiosity. "Hello," he called, breaking the silence of the forest. At first, all he heard was the whisper of the wind. Just as he was about to give up, a soft, childish laugh sounded, sending a new wave of energy through his body. "I'm not going to hurt you, I just want to talk," he said with a touch of enthusiasm. Taking a few more careful steps, he skirted a group of trees and came to a small clearing. There, under the already darkening sky, stood a little girl, no more than 6 years old, with a messy head of brown curls and a simple, colorful but slightly worn dress. Her large, curious eyes, the brown of melted chocolate, met his with a mixture of surprise and joy. "Who are you?" the girl asked, her musical voice breaking the silence. "I'm Charles," he replied, bending down to her level. "And what's your name?" "Barbara," she said proudly, a smile lighting up her face. "I live nearby. Did you see me? I was playing hide-and-seek with the trees." Charles laughed, surprised to realize how long it had been since he'd had a good laugh. "You're really good at hiding, Barbara. I almost didn't see you." Glowing with the compliment, Barbara puffed out her chest with pride. "I can climb trees too. Want to see?" Before he could answer, she ran to a nearby tree, climbing up with the ease of a squirrel. Charles watched in amazement as she perched on a sturdy branch. "Look at me," she cried with glee. "I can see everything from up here." "Be careful," he warned, though he couldn't help but smile at her adventurous spirit. "You're too high." Barbara smiled, swinging her legs. "It's fun up here. You should try it." Charles shook his head, still on the ground. I think I'll leave the climbing to you. I'm not as good at it as you are. With a mischievous glint in her eyes, Barbara climbed even higher, her light laughter filling the air. In that moment, Charles was transported back to a time when his own life had been full of joy and lightness. He thought of his mother, of the music and poetry that flowed through the house, feeling a pang of nostalgia. But along with that memory came a new sense of possibility. "Why are you here alone?" he asked, wishing he knew more about this child who had unexpectedly brightened his evening. Barbara paused, her expression momentarily serious. "I was looking for my mother," she said softly. "But she's not here now." Charles's heart sank at those simple words, but they carried a weight he knew all too well. "I'm sorry about that," he said gently. "Do you want to talk about it?" She shrugged. "Sometimes she leaves, but I know she always comes back," she said with touching conviction. "You're very strong," he murmured, admiring her resilience. "And what do you do while you wait?" "I play," she replied, the childish sparkle returning to her eyes. Her spirits renewed, she declared cheerfully, "I pretend the forest is my kingdom and I am the queen. The trees are my subjects, and the animals come to visit me." Charles smiled fondly and repeated, "Queen Barbara, huh? I like that." He then asked, "And what do you do as queen? Do you have a decree?" She laughed as if the question were the funniest in the world. "Of course. All the animals have to be my friends and bring me fruit to eat." "Fruit, huh? Sounds like a good rule," he replied jokingly. "And the people? Are they welcome in your kingdom?" Barbara paused, thinking seriously before answering, "Only the nice people, and they have to bring me stories. I love stories." Her enthusiasm was contagious, and Charles felt a warmth he had not experienced in a long time. "I know some good stories," he said, as memories of past adventures flooded his mind. "Want to hear one?" "Yes," she exclaimed, almost jumping for joy on the branch she was on. Her eyes bright, she waited anxiously as Charles began to tell a story full of magic and courage. Each word seemed to transport her to another world, where anything was possible. For a few moments, he forgot the sadness that surrounded him. But as the story progressed, the reality of his life came flooding back, bringing back memories of Sandra. He knew how much she would have loved the girl's laughter and encouraged her imagination. The contrast between the joy of the present and the pain of the past made him hesitate, torn between two worlds. "Can you stay a little longer and play with me?" Barbara asked, full of innocent hope. Charles hesitated, remembering his responsibilities. "I would love to," he said sincerely, "but I have to get home. My mother needs me." Barbara's smile faded, and he felt a pang of regret. "Okay, but will you come back tomorrow? I will have more stories for you." The anxiety in her eyes touched Charles deeply, and he responded firmly, "I promise I'll be back. And maybe I'll bring you some fruit too," he said, drawing a new smile from the girl, like a ray of sunshine breaking through the clouds. As he turned to go back home, Charles felt a different emotion, something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Maybe this little girl could help him find a bridge between his past and his present, a way back to the world he had isolated himself from. With one last look at Barbara, perched in a tree, he walked back through the forest, feeling lighter than he had in years. Little did he know that this unexpected encounter would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. As he entered the mansion again, enveloped by the soft morning light filtering through the windows, Charles woke with a new feeling: anticipation. The memory of Barbara and her laughter echoed in his mind, like a promise that lifted him from the depths of loneliness. He hurried through his morning routine, still feeling the weight of his responsibilities, but now with a different energy, something new and invigorating. As he prepared breakfast for himself and his mother, his thoughts returned to the girl in the forest, the image of her climbing the tree with such vivacity igniting a new flame within him. "Good morning, Charles," Mary greeted him as she entered the kitchen. She was a constant and comforting presence. You seem different today. He smiled and admitted, I met someone in the forest yesterday. A girl named Barbara. She has an energy that reminded me of happier times. Mary arched an eyebrow curiously. What do you mean by that? Charles, stirring his coffee, answered absently, It's been so quiet around here. Taking care of Mom has consumed me to the point where I've forgotten what it's like to simply live. Meeting Barbara was like a breath of fresh air. Mary smiled, her eyes shining with understanding. Children have a way of brightening even the darkest places. Maybe she'll be good for both of you. Charles's heart warmed at her words. I was thinking about bringing her here. Maybe she could help my mother, maybe even reconnect her with the music she loved so much. But Mary worried, Charles, I worry about how this might affect your mother. She's fragile, and introducing someone new might be too much. He nodded, but he couldn't help but feel. I know, but I can't help but believe that Barbara can bring some life back into this house. I have to try. A familiar anxiety tightened Charles's stomach as he approached his mother's room. Sandra sat by the window, her gaze lost in the distance, the soft morning light illuminating her silver hair. He approached slowly, feeling the weight of her fragility. Hi, Mom, he said tenderly, sitting down beside her. Remember when we used to play music together? She turned her head slightly, and for a brief moment, he saw a glimmer of recognition in her eyes. Music, yes, it was so beautiful, she murmured, her voice weak. Charles seized the opportunity. Would you like to listen to some today? He asked hopefully. She nodded, and he saw her face soften. With a small speaker, he began to play his favorite classical songs, filling the room with the melodies that had once brought them together. As the music flowed through the room, he watched his mother closely, searching for any sign of connection. For an instant, her eyes lit up. Charles, she said suddenly, her voice firmer than he had heard it in a long time. In the summer, the flowers were blooming. I wrote something, his heart raced at the words. What did you write, Mom? He asked anxiously. She frowned in frustration. I don't remember, but it was something about hope. He repeated the words softly, feeling the weight and beauty of what she had said. That's what I want for us, Mom, he said with emotion. I want to bring hope back into our lives. As he spoke, he took her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin. I met a little girl yesterday. She's full of joy, and I think she can help us find that happiness again. Sandra's gaze drifted to the window again, her expression distant. Children, they bring light, she said as if remembering something far away. Charles squeezed her hand tighter, determined. I'm going to invite her here. I think she can help us. For a brief moment, Sandra's eyes returned to him, with a flash of clarity. Invite her, yes, she whispered, almost as if she understood the meaning of those words. With a new sense of purpose, Charles spent the rest of the morning preparing to meet Barbara. He picked berries, as promised, and gathered some toys and books he had kept from his childhood. They were relics that could now serve as a bridge between the two worlds. As he walked through the forest, the sun shone brighter, illuminating his path. When he reached the clearing, the sounds of nature seemed more alive, more full of promise. Barbara, are you here? He called. The rustle of leaves caught his attention, and soon she appeared, her eyes shining with happiness. You're back, she exclaimed. I promised, didn't I? He replied, smiling. He revealed the berries he had brought, holding them up like a treasure. Barbara's eyes widened with joy as she took the berries, her small fingers touching his in thanks. These are my favorites. Can we eat them while you tell me a story? Charles laughed, his heart light. Sure. Let's find a nice place to sit. They settled down on a soft patch of grass, and as Barbara savored the berries, Charles began to tell a new story. He spoke of adventure, friendship, and the importance of hope. Barbara's laughter was like music, filling the air with a sweetness that echoed through the trees. At that moment, Charles felt a sense of healing begin to blossom within him. "Can I tell you a secret?" Barbara asked, her mouth stained with berry juice. "Sure," he replied, leaning in to listen. "I think your mother would love me. I want to show her how to play music again." Charles's heart skipped a beat. "You think so?" "I know," she exclaimed. "Can I meet her, please?" He hesitated for a moment, unsure. "It's a big step, Barbara. My mother has been a little lost lately." But the girl persisted, her voice firm and determined. "I can make her smile." Charles looked into Barbara's sincere eyes and felt the possibility open up before him. "Okay," he said, "we can go to the mansion together, but you have to promise to be gentle with her. She gets confused sometimes." Barbara smiled enthusiastically. "I promise." As they walked back to the mansion, Charles felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He was entering unfamiliar territory, but the idea of bringing these two worlds together, the lost mother and the lively child, filled him with hope. As they reached the door, he took a deep breath, bracing himself for what was to come. "Are you ready?" he asked Barbara, who nodded vigorously. Together, they entered the mansion, the air heavy with memories and untold stories. Charles knocked softly on the door before opening it, revealing his mother, Sandra, sitting by the window, her eyes lost in thought. "Mom," he said softly as he entered, "I have someone here who would like to meet you." Sandra turned her head slightly, curious, while Barbara peeked shyly from behind Charles's legs. "Who is she?" Sandra asked with a hint of confusion. "This is Barbara, a friend I met in the woods," Charles explained. With bright eyes, Barbara stepped forward. "Hello, Mrs. Harris, I brought you some berries." Charles watched anxiously, waiting for his mother's reaction. A brief flash of recognition passed through Sandra's eyes. "Berries?" she repeated, her voice soft and fragile. "Yes, they are sweet and delicious," Barbara said with infectious enthusiasm. "I want to share them with you." Charles's heart raced as he saw a small smile appear on Sandra's lips, the first in days. "Berries," Sandra murmured, her expression understanding. At that moment, Charles felt a glimmer of hope grow, as if they were finally reconnecting. The soft sunlight flooded the room, creating a golden atmosphere. Charles watched his mother delicately run her fingers over the fruit Barbara had brought, a small gesture but full of meaning. "Do you want to try some, Mom?" Charles asked hopefully. The room seemed suspended, everyone waiting for his answer. Sandra looked closely at the fruit, her expression of concentration deepening. "They look sweet," she said, her voice hesitant. "Just like the ones you used to make," Barbara commented excitedly. "You used to make the best berry pies." Hearing about the pies, Sandra seemed to remember. "Pies, yes, I remember," she said, with a slight smile. Encouraged, Charles picked up one of the fruits and offered it to his mother. "Here, just like old times." Sandra reached out, her fingers trembling, and took the fruit. After a brief pause, she took a bite. The sweetness invaded his palate, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. "Delicious," she whispered, her eyes shining with surprise and joy. Charles's heart swelled with emotion. "I'm glad you liked it, Mom. Barbara picked it out especially for you." Sandra looked at Barbara, who was watching with a radiant smile. "You're a good friend," Sandra said softly. Barbara let out a sweet laugh, filling the room with a joyful sound. "I want to be friends with all of us. We can do so many things together." Charles felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, the room seemed full of life, laughter, and warmth. He exchanged glances with Mary, who was standing in the doorway, her expression one of surprise and relief. "How about some music?" Charles suggested, wanting to keep the moment going. "Mommy always loved music, didn't she?" Sandra nodded slowly, still immersed in her memories. With renewed urgency, Charles grabbed a speaker from the bedside table and selected his mother's favorite songs. As the first notes filled the room, he watched as Sandra's expression softened, her eyes closing at the familiar melodies. "Do you remember this one, Mom?" he asked, warmed by nostalgia. "It's familiar," Sandra replied, frowning slightly as she tried to focus. "I used to dance with you," Charles said, remembering the nights they would twirl around the living room to the music while Sandra played the piano. For a brief moment, it seemed as if she had been transported back in time. "The rhythm, yes," she murmured, with a slight smile. "Can I dance too?" Barbara asked happily. "Of course." Charles replied, laughing as he took her hands and led her in a little dance. The sound of Barbara's laughter and the music filled the air, creating a harmony of joy that echoed through the house. As they danced, Charles glanced at Sandra, who was watching them with a mixture of bewilderment and happiness. He could see a spark of life returning to her eyes. "Come dance with us, Mother," Barbara called, laughing happily. Sandra smiled shyly, her fingers tapping lightly in her lap in time to the music. "I want to," she said, her voice hesitant but full of desire. With a soft whisper, Charles suggested, "Let's do this together." He approached his mother and, with care and encouragement, helped Sandra to her feet. Her movements were hesitant and a little unsteady, but she showed determination. Barbara smiled, moving closer, and soon they were all dancing together. The music enveloped them like a warm embrace, and Charles felt a wave of euphoria wash over him. This was the moment he had been waiting for, a moment of connection, joy, and life. In his mother's eyes, he could see the music pulling her back from the shadows, if only for a moment. "See, Mommy. You're dancing," he exclaimed, his heart racing with excitement. The melody filled the mansion, illuminating it with laughter and light, dispelling the darkness that had settled for so long. But just as the moment arrived, it began to fade. Sandra's movements slowed, and her expression returned to focus with effort. "It's okay, Mom," Charles whispered, his voice full of affection. "You're doing so well." Sandra frowned in frustration. "I can't remember," she said, the frustration evident in her voice. Charles reassured her, gently holding her hand. "It's okay, just enjoy the music." Barbara, sensing the change, moved even closer. "It's okay, Mrs. Harris, we can just listen together." "I love listening to music too," the girl said, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Sandra looked at her, and for a moment her expression softened at Barbara's optimism. "Do you like music?" Sandra asked, still hesitant. "Yes." Barbara exclaimed enthusiastically. "It makes me feel like I can fly." Charles watched, moved, as his mother's smile returned, if only briefly. The music continued to play, and he realized the power it had to bring people together, to break down barriers. "Let's try something," he said suddenly, an idea taking shape. "Barbara, can you help me find my mother's old piano?" Barbara's eyes lit up. "I know where it is," she replied excitedly. "Great. Let's go on an adventure," Charles said, his heart racing with excitement. As they walked through the mansion, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Perhaps, with Barbara's help and her determined spirit, they could not only rekindle Sandra's love of music, but also forge new family bonds. When they reached the living room, the old piano sat there, covered in dust, like dormant memories. Charles felt a pang of nostalgia as he approached, remembering the countless nights his mother would play it, her fingers dancing over the keys like butterflies. "Wow!" Barbara exclaimed in amazement. "It's as big as the music it makes," Charles commented, running his fingers over the keys and allowing the sound to fill the room, lifting the dust from the silence. "Let's see if we can wake it up," he said, smiling as he played a simple melody. He watched Sandra, and for a brief moment, he saw a gleam of concentration in her eyes. The music seemed to reach her, bringing her out of her tangle of confusion. "Can you hear it, Mom?" Charles asked hopefully. "It's your song." Sandra nodded slowly, her fingers trembling slightly, as if trying to join in the melody. "My song," she repeated, a flash of recognition lighting up her face. Encouraged, Barbara clapped her hands. "Can I play too?" she asked eagerly. "Of course." Charles replied, excitement rising within him. He stepped aside, making way for Barbara. Her small fingers touched the keys, and a cascade of notes, although disorganized, filled the air with pure joy. "Look, Mrs. Harris. I'm making music," Barbara exclaimed, laughing, her happiness infectious. Charles, filled with pride, saw life return to his mother's eyes. Perhaps this was the beginning of something beautiful, a connection forged by music, laughter, and the unbreakable bond of family. As they played together, the mansion filled with joyful sounds, echoing through the halls like a promise of better days to come. In that moment, Charles knew they were on the brink of something extraordinary. Hope blossomed in his heart, and the shadows that surrounded them began to dissipate. The sun, slowly setting on the horizon, cast a golden light through the mansion's windows, making the dust motes dance in the air. The sound of the piano, now harmonious, echoed through the halls, a mix of Barbara's notes and the memories that still lived on that old instrument. Charles, standing in the doorway, felt a smile form on his face. Charles watched with a smile as Barbara explored the piano keys, immersed in her own world. Her laughter lit up the room, and Sandra, sitting next to her, watched with an expression of enchantment. It was as if, in that moment, magic had brought life back to the cold walls of the mansion. Suddenly, Sandra, with a voice firmer than in the last few days, said, "Can I try that note?" She pointed to the key that Barbara had just played. "Sure, Mrs. Harris, let me help," Barbara replied, her joy infectious. Carefully, she made room so that Sandra could play. Charles, watching, felt a warmth grow in his chest. He hadn't seen his mother so excited in a long time, as if Barbara were the key that had finally opened a long-locked door. "That's right, Mom, you remember that song. You've played it so many times," encouraged Charles, moving closer. Sandra frowned in concentration, her fingers hesitantly on the keys. "I think so," she answered slowly. Barbara, her eyes shining, said excitedly, "You're the best pianist ever." Charles felt a lump in his throat as he listened to the easy way Barbara spoke to his mother, without fear or hesitation. It was a reminder that love could blossom even in the darkest moments. "Let's play together," Charles suggested, placing his hands next to Sandra's. As the rhythm of the count of 3, the notes began to flow, filling the room with music, like a warm embrace. Sandra, with each key pressed, seemed to rediscover a part of herself, and her eyes began to shine again. As they played, Barbara danced in her chair, laughing as if her own laughter were a melody. "This is so much fun. I love music," she exclaimed. When they finished the piece, a brief silence fell over the room, with the echoes of the music still hanging in the air. Charles looked at his mother anxiously. "How did you feel, Mom?" Sandra smiled slowly, and for the first time in days, there was a light in her eyes. "It felt good. It reminded me, music brings back so many memories." Charles, with a heart full of hope, replied softly, "And it's never too late to make new ones." Barbara, full of enthusiasm, clapped her hands. "Can we play more? I want to learn everything." Sandra, with renewed spirit, agreed, "Yes, let's keep going. I want to teach you." Charles, watching that scene, felt a deep admiration for Barbara. She had brought life back to his home. The afternoon passed and the trio lost themselves in the music, laughing at their mistakes and having fun amidst the joyful chaos that transformed the mansion. Charles felt immense gratitude for that moment, but when he noticed the clock, he realized that time was passing. "Barbara," he said softly, "I think it's time for you to go home for dinner." Barbara pouted, disappointed. "But I wanted to stay a little longer." "I know," Charles said, kneeling down to be at her level. "But your mother is waiting for you. And I want you to come back tomorrow, okay? Barbara's eyes lit up again. I'll come back, can we play the same songs again? Of course, he replied with a smile. And maybe we'll even compose something new together. Yay! I can't wait, she exclaimed excitedly. As they were about to leave, Charles turned to his mother. Are you okay, Mom? Do you want to rest a little? Sandra nodded, her expression soft and calm. I'm fine, Charles. Thank you, it was wonderful. Her words filled Charles's heart with emotion. I'm happy, Mom. You deserve to feel this happiness. With a last hug and the promise to come back the next day, Barbara left the room, her laughter echoing through the hallway. Charles stood for a moment, contemplating his mother, whose strength seemed to revive in the presence of the little girl. Are you feeling better, Mom? He asked softly, sitting down next to her. Yes, Sandra replied, her voice soft but filled with new energy. I didn't realize how much I missed this, the music, the laughter, the connection. Charles's heart warmed at her words. We can keep doing this. Bring Barbara here often. I think she can help us find each other again. I would love that, Sandra said, her eyes shining as unshed tears formed. She's a light, Charles, such a beautiful light. As the sun set and they sat together, Charles felt a hope blossom within him. Maybe together they could face the darkness, one note at a time. Charles felt the weight of his words as Mary approached him with a serious expression. We need to talk, she began, concern evident on her face. What's wrong, Mary? Is something wrong with Sandra? Her voice reflected the growing tension. I'm worried about the effect Barbara's presence might have, Mary explained in a calm but firm tone. Charles, taken aback, tried to argue. Barbara has brought so much joy to my mother, don't you see that? Mary, trying to remain patient, responded softly. I see it, Charles, but we have to think about the long-term consequences. Sandra is fragile, and changes like this can be complicated. Charles's frustration began to show. I understand your concern, Mary, but I can't take that away from them. Not now. Barbara is helping my mother in ways I never imagined. Still, Mary persisted. I just want us to think carefully. We need to make sure this is in the best interests of both of us. Charles took a deep breath, realizing that the conversation was necessary. He knew what they had experienced was precious, but also delicate. Okay, let's talk, he agreed, trying to balance the hope he felt with the caution Mary brought to the discussion. He knew the road ahead would be full of challenges, but he was determined to face them alongside his mother and the little light Barbara had brought. The next day, Charles woke to the soft sunlight streaming through the window, and the memories of the previous day still warmed him. However, Mary's words echoed in his mind, bringing home the reality he needed to face. After a quick shower, he went to the kitchen, where the smell of freshly brewed coffee greeted him. Mary was already there, busy with breakfast. When she looked at him, her expression was a mix of affection and concern. Good morning, Charles. How are you feeling today? She asked. I'm still processing everything, he admitted, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Yesterday was transformative. I haven't seen my mother this excited in a long time. Mary nodded, but her concern didn't go away. It's wonderful to see her smiling again, but we can't forget her fragility, Charles. I understand, he replied, leaning against the counter. But Barbara brought something back to my mother. She's coming back to life. I can't just take it away from her. Mary took a deep breath, trying to make him see the bigger picture. She's just a child, and children can be unpredictable. What will happen when Barbara is no longer around? Will her mother be able to handle her absence? Charles felt conflict building inside him, torn between protecting his mother and caring for Barbara. I'll find a way, he said firmly, before confessing something he'd been thinking about. I want to adopt Barbara. The shock was visible on Mary's face. Adopt her? Charles, have you thought about the implications of that? On Sandra's health? He knew it wouldn't be easy, but his determination was clear. I know it will be difficult, but I can't ignore what Barbara has brought into our lives. She and my mother can help each other heal. Mary sighed, softening her posture. I just ask that you be careful. It's not just about you now. I promise, Charles said, feeling both hope and trepidation. After breakfast, he set off to find Barbara, his heart filled with anticipation. As he walked through the woods, he imagined his mother and Barbara together again, and the vision filled him with renewed determination. When he reached the clearing, he called out to Barbara, and within moments she appeared, beaming. You're back, she exclaimed with joy. Charles smiled, kneeling down to her level. Of course I'm back. Today I have something special for you. I want you to come with me and play music with my mother again. I think it might help you remember more. I can't wait. Barbara said, her eyes shining with excitement. Charles knew that day would be another important step, and he was ready to face the challenges with courage and love. With his heart racing, he couldn't wait to see the sparkle return to his mother's eyes. I'll make her smile again. Barbara said confidently as they walked back to the mansion. Charles felt hope growing within him, imagining that this could be the beginning of something special, a strong bond, intertwined with music, laughter, and love. As they reached the entrance to the large Victorian house, he held the door open for Barbara to enter first. Welcome to my home, he said, trying to convey the importance of this moment. Wow, it's huge! Barbara exclaimed, her eyes widening at the grandeur of the house. Charles led her into the living room, where Sandra, his mother, sat, staring out the window. Mom, there's someone who wants to see you, he said, approaching cautiously. Sandra slowly turned her head, her expression curious. Who is it? She asked, her voice soft and uncertain. It's Barbara, she's back, Charles replied, his heart full of anticipation. The little girl stepped forward, filling the room with her energy. Hello, Mrs. Harris. I brought more berries. Barbara said, lifting the basket she had collected along the way. A flash of recognition crossed Sandra's face. Berries, she murmured, almost in a whisper. Do you remember the fruit pies you used to make? Barbara asked excitedly. Sandra frowned, trying to remember, and for a moment it seemed as if the memories were about to emerge. Pies, yes, I remember the sweet one, she said, her voice a little stronger. Charles felt a spark of hope. That's right, Mom. And Barbara wants to help you make some more pies. Sandra looked from Charles to Barbara, still a little confused, but smiled slightly. We can have a berry party. Barbara exclaimed excitedly. Charles took his mother's hand gently. What do you think, Mom? Would you like to make pies with Barbara? He asked. After a brief hesitation, fighting the fog in her mind, Sandra replied, I think so. A small smile formed on her lips. Let's go to the kitchen, then. Barbara shouted, clapping her hands in delight. Okay, let's go, Charles said, feeling hope blossom within him. Together, they walked toward the kitchen, Barbara's laughter echoing through the halls like a melody of connection and new possibilities. In the kitchen, Charles began to organize everything. Let's get what we need, he said, grabbing bowls and cooking utensils. Barbara, can you help me wash the fruit? Sure. I love washing fruit, she replied, her enthusiasm lighting up the room. As they busied themselves with the preparation, Charles couldn't help but feel that they were creating more than just pies, they were weaving together a new family, full of love, laughter, and hope. The aroma of baking pies soon enveloped the mansion in a warm embrace, transforming the atmosphere. Charles watched Sandra and Barbara interact, laughing together, and felt his heart fill with joy. Mom, can you pass me the sugar? Barbara asked, her little hands covered in dough. Of course, dear, Sandra replied, now more present and involved in every moment with the girl. As they waited for the pies to be ready, Charles could not contain the desire to share something important. "Mom," he began, his heart pounding, "I have been thinking a lot about the future. About how to keep this happiness alive." Sandra looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I want to adopt Barbara," he said, the words coming out like a promise. "I believe she can be part of our family. Together, we can create a new life, full of love and music." Sandra's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, she seemed to struggle to comprehend what he was saying. "Adopt?" she repeated softly, looking at Barbara, who couldn't contain her excitement. "Yes, Mom. I think Barbara helped us heal, and we can do the same for her," Charles explained, his voice firm and confident. Barbara beamed, "I want to be part of your family. We can make music and bake pies forever." Sandra smiled, and in that moment, Charles knew they were on the right path, building something special, a new life filled with love, togetherness, and the promise of a better future. Her heart overflowing with emotion, she looked at them both and said firmly and sweetly, "I think that's a wonderful idea. Barbara deserves a loving home, and together, we can give her that." Barbara's excitement was evident upon hearing those words. "So, does that mean I can stay here?" she asked, vibrating with anticipation. Charles, feeling a rush of warmth inside, replied with a smile, "Yes, it means you'll always have a home with us." With that decision, the atmosphere in the kitchen changed, now filled with a sense of hope and new possibilities. The sound of the timer interrupted the moment, and Barbara, full of excitement, ran to the oven. "The pies are ready," she announced, grabbing her oven mitts and carefully removing the hot trays. The sweet aroma wafted through the kitchen, and Charles couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction that washed over him. As they sat down to enjoy their creations, laughter filled the room, echoing through the rooms of the large house. It was a sound that had not been heard for a long time, a reminder that happiness could be reborn, even after difficult times. Later that evening, they gathered around the piano, playing and singing. The music filled the room, uniting their lives in a beautiful melody of connection and renewal. Each chord resonated with the promise of a new beginning, where love and joy would triumph over any shadows of the past. However, the light-hearted mood was interrupted by a knock on the door, which brought a wave of apprehension. Charles exchanged a glance with Mary, who was watching from the doorway, and concern etched his face. "Who could it be?" he asked in a low, uneasiness-filled voice. Mary cautiously opened the door, revealing a serious-looking social worker accompanied by a police officer. Charles's heart sank as he realized the gravity of the situation. "Charles Harris?" the worker asked, her tone firm. "Yes, it's me." "What's going on?" she replied, trying to remain calm. "We've received reports about the well-being of a child who lives in this home," the woman said, her eyes darting around the room. "We need to ask her some questions." Barbara's eyes widened, fear etching into her expression. "What's going on?" she asked, confused. Charles knelt down beside her, holding her small hands. "It's okay, Barbara. Let's answer some questions, okay?" he reassured, while the social worker's gaze softened slightly as she took in the scene. "We need to make sure Barbara is in a safe and stable environment," she said, still serious but more compassionate. Maria, in turn, stepped forward, her protective instincts activated. "She's safe here. Charles has been an excellent provider of love and care, and we are all committed to her well-being," she argued. "I understand," the social worker said, scanning the room more closely. "But we have to follow procedures." As the questioning began, Charles felt his anxiety grow, but he calmly explained his intentions to adopt Barbara. He spoke of the joy and stability she had brought to their lives, and of the bond that had formed between her and Sandra. As he shared his story, the social worker began to better understand the depth of their relationship, and her demeanor gradually softened. "I can see that Barbara is happy here, and that you are committed to her well-being," she admitted after a few tense moments. "However, we need to conduct an assessment of the home to make sure everything is in order. Charles nodded with relief. I understand, and we are willing to cooperate fully. When the meeting ended, the social worker assured him that, barring any surprises, the adoption process would move forward. With the door closed, the tension in the air dissolved, giving way to a renewed sense of hope. I was so scared, Barbara confessed, her eyes still wide with concern. I know, honey, but it's going to be okay, Charles reassured her, wrapping her in a hug. You're safe with us. Sandra, looking at Barbara with a warm smile, added, You are now part of our family, and we will always be here for you. As the sun set, casting a golden light over the room, Charles felt a deep gratitude for all they had overcome together. Although there were still challenges ahead, they were ready to face them as a true family. In the days that followed, the home assessment went smoothly, and the social worker carefully observed the bond that existed between Charles, Sandra, and Barbara. The love that filled their home was undeniable. Soon, the paperwork was completed, formalizing the promise of a new life together. On the day the adoption was finalized, the mansion was filled with laughter and joy, as friends and neighbors gathered to celebrate the formation of a new family, united by the love of their lives, love and hope. With hands clasped together, Charles was overcome by a profound sense of accomplishment. They had faced the hardships of isolation and anguish together, emerging stronger and more united than ever. In that moment, he understood that the concept of family transcends blood, it is shaped by the love and solidarity between those who care for one another. Looking at Sandra and Barbara, he knew they had built something truly special, a tapestry rich in resilience, laughter, and the music that brought them together. Here's to new beginnings, he exclaimed, raising a glass filled with sparkling cider. The two families celebrated together, their voices ringing in unison, filled with joy. Charles felt the weight of the past dissipate, replaced by the promising prospect of a future illuminated by laughter, music, and love. As the evening wore on, amidst stories and songs, he realized he was building a path to follow, a path guided by the light of hope, eternally woven into the beautiful dance of life. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment below and share what resonated with you. We want to hear your thoughts. If you've been through something similar or know someone who has, please don't hesitate to share your story, we love reading stories like yours. And remember to like and subscribe for more heartwarming stories.